I'm very pleased to be here and to moderate this great panel. So just a few words about ANREV. We are an industry body for investors in non-listed listed funds in Asia-Pac. We're trying to improve transparency and best practices. So obviously Australia is already highly transparent for us and one of the easiest markets to work with, and very nice to be here again. So we publish a couple of research throughout the year. We publish indices of performance of funds, and we also promote best practices. And part of those standards are actually covering sustainability, with ESG being more and more important for investors, institutional investors. We see that investment managers and institutional investors needs to have a common dialogue and share some resources together. So we actually endorse some reporting guidelines on sustainability. You can find them on our websites. We try to promote endorsement of those guidelines and to, again, facilitate communication between investment managers and institutional investors. So today's event is going to focus on sustainability in the hotel life cycle. It's very interesting for us. So first to talk about sustainability, because part of our remit with ANREV, our counterpart in Europe, is really to increase awareness on that topic, and also talking about hotel as a new ex-niche investment sector. So that's going to be very interesting. Without further ado, I'd like to go to my panel. So today we have a very distinguished panel to talk about the topic. So first, Sabine Schaeffer, who is managing partner for ProInvest Group. Then Carlos Flores, director at Neighbors, and Virginie Sandia, which is associate director at CEFC. Would you like to quickly introduce yourself?
Many thanks, Emily, for the kind introductions. So my name is Sabine Schaeffer. I don't think I have to give too much of introductions here, as I think the majority of the people in the audience know about myself and ProInvest, but just quickly. So ProInvest is a private equity real estate firm that effectively evolved into the biggest hospitality-focused platform in Australasia over the last couple of years. We work in very close partnership with parties such as IHG, rolling out their Holiday Inn Express brand, which is obviously a world-leading select service brand. Where we are different from other parties is that we are not just asset managers, but as well as the hotel operator, all under one roof, which I guess allows us to be in a fortunate position to look after, things like ESG and sustainability, literally from A to Z. So we are responsible for what is happening from the outset, and obviously if things are not turning out as they should be at the end, then we obviously have the means as well to change things with regards to water or energy consumption. So pass on to Carlos.
My name is Carlos Flores. I'm the director for Neighbors here nationally in Australia, and I'm a mechanical engineer, so don't take that against me. But I'm actually Chilean born and raised, and I realized this is a really international panel, which is great. Says a lot about what Life is Australia really is all about. The Neighbors, if you're not, can I just get a show of hands? If you're medium to high familiarity with Neighbors, I just want to know how many people. Great, so about 40 to 50% of the room. If you don't know much what Neighbors is actually the single largest building sustainability certification in Australia, especially for large buildings beyond individual houses. And we work with a lot of hotels and with a lot of organizations like ProInvest, but also with offices and shopping centers and in hospitals. And we're actually moving into pretty much, all building classes and assets that you can think of. And I'm really excited about this session. I think the intersection between finance and sustainability is really, it's going to be a huge driver for sustainability and for many of us who are working in areas like climate change and water security and waste going forward. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Great. And I'm Virginie Sandelia from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. I'm in the investment team, sit across various sectors, but including property. So for those who don't know the CEFC, we were created in 2012. We're a government organization that is run privately. Our mission is to help Australia transition into a low carbon economy. That's a big task, given the current emissions profiles of Australia. We were granted $10 billion of capital, and we invest primarily in renewable energy but also energy efficiency and low emission technology. So property and real estate is obviously a big focus for us given the emissions of the sector, roughly 20 to 25%. But we look as well as other sectors such as infrastructure, manufacturing, agriculture, etc. So we have a very broad mandate, and our aim is to bring private capital alongside us, so crowding other investors to achieve our mission, which is a pretty big one. We invest debt and equity, and pretty much anything in between. So we have a lot of flexibility in investments, type of investments. What we do, it depends on the project and what impact we drive. We're all about outcomes, and we're focusing on carbon. That's probably the main difference between us and other, let's say, ESG types of investors that look at broad ESG as a theme. We're very specific. We're carbon driven. To touch on property and because this is today's big theme, right? So as I mentioned earlier, property is about 25% of the emissions of Australia. And if you actually include embodied emissions, so emissions through construction, you look at a much higher number. So that's about 40%. So for us, when we look at property, this is a key sector to target. And that would be mostly through energy efficiency. So how can we look at investments, debt or equity that will drive energy efficiency outcomes? So we looked at the broad spectrum of real estate. A large component of our portfolio, which is around 1.5 billion at the moment, is in office. But we also have investments in shopping centres through funds. Hospitality is one of them. Student accommodations, healthcare. So it's a very broad property type of investment that we look at, and we're able to derive a lot of learnings from all the investments we make and help the industry look at more energy efficiency going forward for other projects.
Okay, Carlos, do you want to give us a bit more information on neighbours and what you're trying to do? And I'll give you the clicker so you.
May I start by
managing
saying, if you're not that familiar with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, we've been working with them for quite a few years, and I love the amount of creativity they brought into how to use finance for reducing carbon. And there's just so many really smart and different ways of using finance to drive carbon emission reduction. And it's just really interesting. They brought a lot of dynamism to this sector in the last few years. So a lot of people know this. For those of you that don't, and maybe before I get there, I think it's just good to just reflect for a second why we're here and why a lot of us are so interested in this intersection between finance and sustainability. We have, a climate crisis, and we have literally 10 years to get an enormous amount of carbon reduction across our economy. Is a huge challenge. It's good to remember that requires an enormous amount of emissions in all sectors, not just hotels, not just property, across the entire economy, and is actually really pressing time-wise. So that's one reason. Also, living in Australia, been here for 10 years. I'm from Chile, which is also a country that has a lot of issues around water and water security. Australia may be the single country in the world with the highest, or continent in the world with the highest amount of issues around water security and the amount of water. And it's just, if you go around and see the dam levels in cities like Sydney, you realize that, it's a really pressing situation if it doesn't rain soon. And if you look out the window right now, you actually won't see much because of the amount of bushfires, and that's, direct consequences for climate change and a reminder of the kind of things that we could see in the future if we don't act. And we also do work on areas like waste. So we're going to talk a lot about energy today, but we do work on energy, water, waste, and other issues. And waste, we're also facing the biggest waste crisis globally we've ever faced. And some of you may have worked in waste before, and if you do, you probably know that the waste crisis has been brewing for decades. It's just that for many of us who didn't work on waste before, we've just been realizing how big the problem is in the last few years and how much infrastructure is needed globally to recycle and reuse more. So we have some of the biggest environmental challenges we'll ever face. We need to move really fast. And the thing about it is that we actually need to reduce our environmental footprint for real, the actual environmental footprint. So it's not enough to do things that help a little bit, we actually need to change the way we do things quite dramatically. And so with that context, what we do in Neighbours is we basically, maybe what makes Neighbours different than a lot of other sustainability schemes, not just in Australia, but actually around the world, is the fact that we measure. And we measure in a Neighbours energy rating, your energy consumption. In a water rating, is your water consumption. So your rating, 3 stars Neighbours energy in hotels, means that you're using an average amount of energy compared to a similar hotel in the same climate zone, the same city, the same size, same operational conditions. If you're 4-star, we compare you against a 4-star hotel, not against a motel. So it's an indication of, are you using a lot more or a lot less energy than this comparable asset in the same market? That's really what we do. 3 stars means that you're doing an average amount of energy use. 1 star means that you're using a lot more than that average, 60, 70% more. You can also be 0 stars, which a lot of people that are not familiar with Neighbours don't know. You can be 0 because there's actually no limit to how inefficient a building can be. And you see that around the world, there are buildings that use 2, 3, 4 times more energy than the average. So there's no limit to how bad a building can be. But also, the other side of the scale, if you're 5 stars, it means that you're doing exceptionally well. You're using significantly less than the average, and 6 stars even better. Just to give you an idea, 6 stars is actually 75% less energy consumption than the average. So you can't just get there by just putting a couple of small things and painting them green and telling everyone that you're great. It actually requires good technology, good operations, an organization that's actually committed and they're looking actively for opportunities year by year. That's what it takes to be 6 stars, and that's what it takes to be 5 stars. So that's Neighbours in a nutshell. I want to tell you about who's using Neighbours, and I wanted to give you a visual representation. If you walk from Central Station in the Sydney CBD to Circular Quay, it's probably a half an hour walk. And if you walk it, you're literally surrounded by buildings that have been certified by Neighbours. But I don't mean in the last 20 years, I mean the last 12 months, like in 2019. Most of those buildings have been doing it for a long time, and a lot of them have reduced energy significantly. Having said that, a lot of those buildings are in the office and shopping centre markets, which are 2 markets where we've done a lot of work. Hotels is a much more recent market for us, and obviously it's in much more early stages of that development. But it's just good to remind ourselves there's a lot of people working on improving buildings already. In Australia, it's actually quite special in that sense around the world. There's not that many countries where you can see that, if any country where you see that amount of people certifying and tracking their performance and improving over time. The last thing I want to say is to talk about the improvement. So, one thing, it's great to get Neighbours ratings and track your performance, but the question is, are buildings actually reducing energy consumption and reducing the carbon footprint? So what this graph is showing is we take the first time a building joins the program, and we call that the first rating, and then we see what happens on the second year, and the second rating, and the third year, and the fourth year. And what this is showing is the average improvement year by year in the office sector. And by the way, this curve is the fastest reduction of energy consumption and carbon emissions of any sector in Australia, and arguably the fastest of any building sector in any country in the world. And there's a lot of reasons why that's happening, but one of them is the fact that Neighbours has been in that market for a long time. We've found companies that are very receptive and very proactive in the private sector, and we had some really good policy, creating really good drivers for energy efficiency in offices. I do have one more slide just to show you that this is not just offices. This is the same slide for shopping centres, another sector where we've had a lot of people participating for a lot of years. And this reflects, I think it's about 60% of all the shopping centre area across the country. So offices, shopping centres, very different sectors, but what they have in common is that the technologies that use energy consumption are the same. It's lighting, it's heating, it's air conditioning, it's lifts. And it's not just in offices and shopping centres, it's the same in hotels. Any building pretty much uses the same technologies in different proportions. This kind of savings that we've seen across the office sector and across shopping centres are actually possible in pretty much any building sector that you can think of, including in hotels. I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Talk or tell you a little bit about, I guess, why we decided to focus on hospitality as an industry, which is probably a bit more the unusual for Australia from an investment perspective. And secondly, I guess the tangible impact that we were able to achieve thanks for partnering up with entities such as CEFC, as well as obviously neighbor ratings, and the, I guess, dollar benefit at the end of the day that we and obviously our investors are deriving of such. So, and to your point, Emily, about the document that you see on your seats, or probably now you're sitting on it, is a recent research that we undertook together with Prekin. I guess people in the audience here may be familiar with Prekin, which is effectively one of the world's biggest, I guess, databases when it comes to fund managers and I guess the performance of various investment vehicles. And this is also where this data that you see up here on the screen comes from. So that slide, if I should summarize it, effectively shows you that if you compare the hospitality real estate performance over the last kind of vintages, which is effectively vintage 2011 onwards, effectively the real estate hospitality index outperformed the MSCI US REIT consisting out of everything else, being offices, being retail, as well as other kind of real estate sectors. So I think this is already very interesting. I also happen to know that institutes such as IPD Australia with a very similar chart with regards to the overall performance of hotels or hospitality assets compared to all other real estate asset classes. Again, outperformed in Australia over the last 10 years. So I guess despite of what the general rule on the street is, whereby people believe if you can only make money in a hotel if you're the kind of third investor, because the third one goes bankrupt while developing it, the second one goes bankrupt while trying to operate it, and then the third one eventually makes some money. I think we're a live example of how you can actually make fairly good money in this sector. And obviously this is based on the fact that we know what we're doing from an asset management, develop, as well as operations perspective. The second chart on the right, again, shows you the same in terms of an IRR output. And again, hospitality is coming out on top here. The next slide shows you the interest that we see, or I would rather say the increased interest that Prekin sees from more and more institutional investors for the sector, which is also something that's new and almost a worldwide phenomenon. So again, it used to be commercial, retail, I guess residential, and then some alternatives like logistics, but nobody wanted to invest in hospitality. Well, there is generally speaking quite a big trend out there that sees, public pensions, superannuations, foundations, endowment plans, etc., starting to, have a very close look into it, because the asset class as such becomes more institutional. People are interested in the yield they're able to achieve, and I guess, also from a overall yield perspective in particular, in a in the low interest rate environment we are all in. People quite like the kind of higher yield that you're able to derive out of those assets, as long as you know how to actively manage them.
Just to add something to this, from the investor perspective that we represent, definitely more interest in other asset class, more niche, and the office sector, retail and industrial being really highly developed already for their portfolio. So it's definitely something they look into, and some evidence of performance is helping with that, definitely. Just to follow on this, I think you have developed a good platform and some expertise in hotel management and operation. Do you want to touch a bit on this?
Yeah, sure. Actually, our head of our hotel operations is sitting here, Phil Casellas. So he's heading our kind of hotel operations team that consists out of people with decades of experience in doing nothing else but managing hotels in Australia and New Zealand, and that certainly helps the knowledge of how to make sure that you have the kind of right lean management in place. Being able to have conservative forecasts, achieving those, and all the rest of it goes hand in hand with a capable operating team. And I do believe we do certainly have one of the best in the country.
And to link that with sustainability, I think Carlos was great in presenting what NABERS is doing in the office sector, retail sector. But I think definitely hospitality and hotels is something you want to touch on, and you want to increase maybe ratings on the hotels. Is there? Maybe
I'm going to take this question from, what are some things that have changed or are changing in the hotel sector in recent years? And because it is a sector where we've seen pockets of excellence in sustainability, but what we haven't seen is a wide change that we've seen in offices and shopping centres going from, if you go back 15 years, offices and shopping centres in Australia were probably average or maybe even underperformed against Europe, most of Europe and in Japan and North America. Fast forward 2019, Australia is unquestionably the #1 office sector and shopping center sector in the world, and there's a lot of companies that come here to learn how do you do sustainability well within a portfolio? A lot of investors have a lot of their eyes on those portfolios in Australia. So I don't think the hotel sector as bulk is there, but we've seen pockets of change in the last couple of years, and I think the step that pro-investors have taken in the last few weeks, and it was announced. I think 2-3 weeks ago I was on holiday, so I don't know the exact date, but a couple of weeks ago, it's a huge step of leadership. It's a single portfolio in Australia that set a really ambitious target a few years into the future. They're actually doing pretty well already, and they're putting the highest target that any portfolio in the country in hotels have announced. And that's exactly the kind of leadership that we need in the hotel sector. What I think has changed in the last maybe 2 or 3 years is that energy efficiency traditionally in hotels has been all about reducing costs. And I think there's still a lot of money to be made from energy efficiency and still a big driver. But I think there's maybe 2 additional drivers that are really going to change things around in the next couple of years. The first one is that we're actually hearing some really big procurers or bookers of hotel rooms asking pretty tough questions about sustainability. We've had 3 or 4 state governments and the Australian government asking, well, can we use our procurement power, our $200 million of hotel rooms, a lot of them within the CBDs, capital cities, and even more so, and also in regional Australia. Can we use that as a way? Can we ask minimum requirements the way we do it already in the hotel sector? If you have $200 million of hotels saying we're no longer going to stay in hotels that are below 3.5, 4-star neighbors, that would actually mobilize a portion of the market. Those conversations are having, and there are portions of industry that are advocating the government to do that already. We've heard a lot of big corporate asking for what is your hotel doing in sustainability and carbon emissions, not just the things that you have on your website. What are your carbon emissions? Are you using less than others? What's your targets 5 years into the future? And that conversation it's been, the hotel sector's been behind by a few years on that. But if we look at other sectors, particularly shopping centers and hotels, where that pressure's been there for a few years, that completely transformed the sector. So I think that's coming. The pressure from users, I think, is a big driver that is coming to the hotel sector. And the second is actually from investors. If that pressure from users is there and you're likely to lose business if you do nothing, or gain business if you actually do energy efficiency, that's very likely to also drive more investment into portfolios that do something and less investment into others that don't. Shopping centers, great example of that. Government is not a big procurer of shopping centers or a player at all, but investors have been looking at shopping center companies in the last few years and putting a lot of pressure into, especially institutional investors who are moving into the hotel sector now. If you don't have a good score on Neighbours and on GRESB internationally or the Dow Jones, we're just not going to invest in your portfolio. And if you're dropping on those scores, we're going to call, the fund managers will call you. So I think those drivers are cost, users demanding higher standards on climate change, and investors demanding more responsible and sustainable performance of their assets. I think are drivers that are going to change the hotel sector in coming years.
Just again to echo that, definitely on the institutional investor side, the sustainability discussion, the ESG discussion, is the first step for a lot of our members. They just don't want to talk to any investment managers if they don't have a ESG policy, and this is definitely not a trend. It's really something to stay. Actually, just to mention that in our DDQ, the due diligence questionnaire that the industry came with, a lot of the questions are not focused on sustainability. That needs to be addressed at the very beginning of the discussion with an investor and investment manager. Virginie, on your side, I mean, you have obviously some financing power, and how do you see due diligence being impacted in that way with sustainability matters?
For us, I mean, sustainability is one of the key themes, right? So it's not just about the economical sides of the investment and the returns. It's about impact. That's the main gate for us to be able to look at an investment. Otherwise, it wouldn't go through our board. We take it as sound investment returns are given when we look at an investment. So our approach, and it's throughout real estate, is to look at what are the current industry standards? What change can we drive, and what are the other investors doing? And to echo what Carlos was saying around the office sector, this is where we started our journey in real estate, and we've seen tremendous change happening in the past 3 years, where very ambitious targets were set up in respect to net zero and improving over time, and that's a learning that we can really see how a few players can actually start changing an industry and start changing what becomes business as usual for office and premium, and A grade for that type of sector. But it's throughout other asset classes. So. When we look at new investments, for us it's important to have a point of comparison. And actually, if you can go back a couple of slides, and that's something that resonates with a lot of investors, is to be able to compare. Because if you don't have a point of comparison, it's actually really hard, right? It's a little bit like buying a fridge. You don't know what's the energy consumption until you look at the star rating on the door, and then you think, okay, well, actually now I get it. This is what I'm buying. The difference, actually, if you're developing the asset, you can actually have an impact on the star rating on the door. There's a lot of ratings available out there for us because we look at carbon. Neighbors is obviously a direct. It's a direct comparison point, whereas there's other ratings that have merit that look at a more holistic type of approach. And I think the more investors use these ratings, the more it will actually help the industry gets better and sustainability become just mainstream. Won't be just a separate theme, that just business as usual.
It's just on this very point, and again, coming from hotels, everybody's used to, I guess when you go on your corporate trip, you normally say, well, I don't want to stay at a 2-star and probably not at a 5-star, but it has to be a 3 or 4-star, right? So we already use ratings for hotels anyway. So how difficult is to say, well, guess what, I just don't want to stay at a neighbors rated hotel that is, below 3-star neighbors rated. It will come, guaranteed, because you already have a rating of hotels anyway. It's a logical thing. Anyway, so. Yeah.
You're just going into my next point, so, which is like just to make it a bit more specific for hotels. So how do we make hotel more sustainable? What is do you want to talk about the Greener Stay initiative? And I think you have a slide on this.
Sure, yeah. Sure. So there are indeed multiple ways, and we will also elaborate a little bit what you can do if you are fortunate enough to, I guess, develop from scratch. Because yes, there is a bit of an advantage to future-proof your hotels as you can design them the way you want. But things that you can set up that actually have no real capex as such associated with are initiatives such as the Greener Stay. Now, this is something that, to be fair, IHG started off as an initiative in some of their estates in Europe as well as in the US. We were the first ones to adopt it here in Australia, and obviously a lot of other IHG assets followed suit. The idea is fairly simple. There is a small card which basically says, if you are a guest that stays for more than 2 nights, you can opt out of room cleaning. Now the reason why, and if you do so, by the way, you will be getting a couple of loyalty points from the IHG rewards system as a thank you. And the reason why this is actually something that is an obvious thing to opt in for a lot of people is that, think about it at home, you not probably have somebody who's vacuum cleaning behind you every day, or who's going to make up your bed every day, or who's going to clean the bathroom, the smallest detail on a daily basis. So it actually, or changes the linen every day, or the towels, right? So it actually is something that makes a lot of sense for the traveler. He gets some points. For, IHG, because obviously you stay, because you're environmental friendly and you stay in touch as well with your customers, but also really importantly for the hotel operator and the owner of the hotel, because you save a tremendous amount on a cost for room cleaning that you now no longer have to pay. So to put this into dollar amounts, to make it a bit more meaningful, across the 4 assets that we are having or that are operational today, we were able to save close to $160,000 last year just because of implementing these initiatives. Again, very little capex. All it takes is really training some of your staff to make sure that people are aware of this initiative, and the actual tangible, savings of $160,000. So again, this is just one of the examples of, how to make hotels more sustainable. This slide is effectively touching on what Carlos already mentioned before, which is the fact that the CBD is currently reviewing the kind of requirements for neighbors rating for hotels, and if this is going to be coming through, and it will eventually, it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when, it will mean that government employees or government associates will no longer be allowed to stay in hotels that are below a certain neighbors rating. It will exactly the same thing will happen in hotel space as it did very successfully on the commercial side, right? So again, it's just a question of when, not of if. This actually was our first asset, which is Sydney Macquarie Park. And here you see as well, by the way, on an ongoing basis, so although this is a new build asset that we were able to design already in a, I guess, fairly energy efficient manner, thanks to, I guess, participations with parties such as Measurable and others, we are able to track and monitor on an ongoing basis our water consumption as well as the energy consumption. And as a result of that, are able to improve, where necessary. So you see, for example, that our GHG emission per room, we were able to decrease it by almost 7% year on year, and the same with the water consumption. And again, the neighbors rating didn't change necessarily, or at least it improved, but we didn't quite. I think we're now at 4.9 something.
Closer to 5 stars, almost.
Exactly, but for some reason you can't round up. Anyway, but so there is, unfortunately, still trying, but there is a clear benefit of having an ongoing kind of monitoring in place as well. And then I guess the last kind of area here is, as I mentioned before, we also are fortunate to have an excellent development team in-house that is headed by Tim Sherlock, who's sitting over there. What happened there was, this was actually the first time that, I guess, ProInvest and CFC kind of joined forces. CFC in that particular case as a debt provider, in order to assist us and make our South Bank asset, so Melbourne South Bank, a 5-star neighbours rated hotel. As I think Carlos mentioned before, this is not a trivial exercise, but here you see some of the initiatives that we were able to highlight effectively before we started with the building. And those initiatives go from special glazing to improved air-chilled coolers, to things like regenerative lift drivers. So there is to obviously installing, I guess, photovoltaics, so solar panels on top. So there's a lot of initiatives that you can undertake, and for us it was effectively just a simple exercise of looking, well, which are the initiatives that we could be implementing, what are the capex costs that have to be kind of set aside for those, what are the benefits that we believe we'll be able to get out of those initiatives over the next 10 years to come, and then if there was still effectively a delta, we were able to effectively procure a slightly cheaper debt facility with the help of CEFC. But again, it is something that should become a given, and as a result of that, in Fund 2, where CEFC is now as well a partner with us, we have the 5-star neighbor targets for all of our hotels. And I guess as we are doing more and more, we're obviously becoming better in, I guess, putting some initiatives in early on. From a capex perspective, it's something that is definitely manageable.
If I can add maybe one thing on the previous one, so when we looked at the initiatives, we started from the baseline of what the hotel would look like without our involvement, and it was already quite efficient. So you were looking at a 4.5-star neighbors hotel, which I believe would be already quite out there in respect to design and energy efficiency. So for us, it was really to look at what else can we do and how can we really drive something that is very exemplar, which I think is what we've achieved with ProInvest, is to look at, okay, what other initiatives can we put on top to really have a really good asset, which I think would, once it's officially rated, should be one of the highest in Australia, I presume.
Can I add one more thing to that? I think and this is a really good summary. What things can you do to improve a hotel? And one of the things that is very special about hotels is that you can interact with the customers and get them to help you to reduce energy and water consumption, and in doing that, actually enhance their experience, because a lot of them actually want to do that. And I think that's brilliant. And obviously, when you're creating a new hotel, you can design it as a blank canvas, so you can go all the way to maximum efficiency, which is really what you guys have done in this building, which is great. But maybe one more thing I would add is that every hotel, it doesn't matter how efficiently you designed it, has opportunities to keep reducing. And that's partly because technology on all the, hotels are massive machines with thousands of parts. And how you operate them is really important. The fact that so many 4.5 stars in the portfolio kind of tells you already that, this hotel portfolio has, a pretty strong operational team. That's definitely not the norm in hotels 4.5 stars, just so you know, it's much closer to the average with 3 stars still. But every hotel, no matter how high, has opportunities to keep improving. And many of those opportunities are often $0 opportunities. Sometimes it's about monitoring what's happening when there's not that many people in the hotel. Can the air conditioning run lower? Maybe some days of the week, you predictably know that you're operating at 40 or 30% of the rooms full in certain parts of the year, which means you can run all your systems at par low capacity and save energy. So there's every building in those opportunities exist in all of them. And the more we advance, the more organizations are setting targets and working on that, they start developing the industry, the services industry, and the engineers and the architects that we need to make that a lot lower cost and a lot more systematic to achieve them in a lot more hotels.
Cindy van der Wal, she's our ESG coordinator, and really, I guess the reason for her existence within ProInvest is to look at, and the asset management, and the development, and the hotel operation side, identify various initiatives that we can implement, and then make sure that those actually are being implemented, and making sure that, whenever they tend to fall away from the list of priority, to kind of ratchet back up. So I guess thanks to her, we were able to implement a number of, waste initiatives, try out things, look at, this is not just on the environmental side, but also on the social side, have very kind of charity activities, training of people. There's so much, you're absolutely right, there's so much you can do with hotels because it's not a living asset, but it's an operational asset that day-to-day needs day-to-day care. And as a result of that, has the potential to outperform, absolutely. Because you can, if something is wrong, you can immediately react to it, which is much harder to do if you have a commercial asset, for example, or I guess a retail asset as well to some degree.
Well, I think across all types of asset, that data is very, very important. If you're able to monitor your energy consumption on a live, real live basis, you can save a lot of money. You don't have to wait for the end of the quarter or even worse, the year. One of the initiatives that was actually, I think, listed on this side is around tuning and having a BMS that works. That can lead to a lot of savings if it's done properly and you have actually the personnel in place to look at those numbers. And there's a lot of consultants these days that can easily do that job, and that translates into lower bills.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So, Sabine, you alluded to the agreement you had with the CEFC on trying to improve neighbors rating for all your hotels. What's the plan? So Melbourne was a good example. So how do you plan together, Virginie and yourself, to roll that out for other hotels?
So we actually set up something that's now referred to as the ESG committee, which effectively holds 2 members from CFC, 2 members from ProInvest, depending on the project we're working on. But yeah, the clear target is to achieve a 5-star neighbors rating, I guess, throughout the estate. So at the moment, ProInvest is either has or is developing 12 hotels, and obviously going forward with Fund 2, we should be reaching the 20 figure very soon. Within the committee, there is obviously, like we just showed here, there's a number of initiatives that will be discussed whenever the opportunity comes up, and also something else I guess we benefit from is, as Virginie can comment on probably better than I do, the experience, the expertise that sits within CFC, the fact of having invested in a number of different entities that, for example, some new technology, things that we may not be aware about, but because CFC, has the expertise, they can point us out to the right direction.
There's also the energy angle that we're very attached to around how can hotels start procuring green power. This is the demand, right, for renewable energy that will start making larger changes in the country around the energy profile. So that is an initiative that is very close to our heart, and we'll continue to investigate with ProInvest. There's another initiative around carbon offsets that we think is interesting. The possibility to actually for guests or corporates to offset their stay. We think that could be also a way to have guests engaged. not just going to a hotel, paying and leaving, being a little bit more engaged with their stay around doing something a little bit better for the environment. So these are all examples, and I'm sure there'll be more as we continue the journey. But we're very happy, obviously, with the targets of neighbors rating of 5 stars, which is for us, I mean, is the first in Australia, and we actually believe in the world, right? So it's this is really like a leadership piece.
Yeah, we did actually try to. We asked a couple of advisors and kind of global financial consultancy firms, and yeah, it appears that on a portfolio level, we definitely are, globally speaking, we're trying to fulfill the highest level.
And Carlos, how close we are to have neighbors ratings for hotels now?
I think it's maybe a better question for you, because once we get there, we're 10 days away from certify, and often I think it's like 3 or 4 days on average. But
yeah, you just have to work on the rounding a bit, but other than that, that's fine. No, but I think it's more the question of when it's going to become mandatory for hotels.
I see. Yeah. So we actually didn't really mention this explicitly, but the Commonwealth government at the moment publicly has been consulting on whether neighbours ratings should be made mandatory for all hotels bigger than a certain size. At the moment, the size proposed is about 100 rooms, with a potential expansion in the future. Expansion by that I mean smaller hotels up to 50 rooms, and that is a formal policy. It was out for consultation the last 2 months. The next stages are that it will go into Minister Angus Taylor, who's the Energy Minister, and then the Minister will be making a determination based on that. But so just so we understand what that proposal is, because it's different than government procurement. This is about all hotels being mandated to know how energy efficient they are compared to their competitors, and B, having to tell everyone who comes into your hotel, potentially outside of the door of your hotel, this hotel is 3 stars or this hotel is 3.5 stars. That's basically how it works at the moment in the office sector. And in the office sector, it's literally mobilized the whole sector, and that's how we got so many buildings reducing the energy emissions in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, if that proposal would happen, we'll probably get news about that somewhere in this financial year, possibly in the next 6 months. And it might take another year to fully implement before it's mandatory. But what it means is that is an amount of transparency and information that this sector has never had. And many of you work in the investment side of things. It means that you would actually know how exposed many of these hotels are to changes in carbon policy, for example, which are things that are really, really hard to evaluate right now. It's a lot easier where you can tell, this hotel is using 60% more energy than the average. It's 1.5 stars. This other investment that last week looked identical is actually 5 stars. It uses a third of the amount of energy. It's got lower costs, and it's a lot less exposed to government policy and governments not wanting to go into those hotels anymore, or major corporates not wanting to go into those hotels. So that policy has a significant amount of potential to change a lot of things around investment, and again, it's public consultation, but we'll hear about whether that will be mandated possibly in the next 6 months or the next 12 months.
I think what's interesting as well is you work with global brands like hotel operators and so on. So I'd be interested to know whether they are thinking of trying to replicate that elsewhere in the world as well, because obviously Australia has been really leading the way in terms of sustainability practices for every sector. But like hotel brands being global, it probably makes sense for them to work on a global basis as well.
It is, and this is actually a really interesting point, and we discussed this at one of the GREST meetings. It's fascinating to see that in the hotel space, you actually have an awful lot of, let's say, sustainability programs, right? What is it really standing for? Now, by trying to find, and you can't, it's hard to measure it's hard to know about your performance if you can't measure things. So by trying to find a common denominator, such as neighbors, all of a sudden it becomes clear. It doesn't matter if it's a Marriott, an Accor hotel, an IHG hotel, or whichever hotel it is, there's one rating system, and it's called neighbors. And that is going to bring a lot of visibility and also responsibility that comes along with it, into the industry, I believe.
I'm very aware of the very, very high number of initiatives in this space. Some of them higher quality than others, but the problem with the very low quality ones is that you can literally sit down and fill in a survey and get a stamp that says your hotel is green, and then promote yourself as green for the next 20 years. That's happening in the hotel sector. there's hardly every sector, any hotel I've ever stayed that doesn't say that they're super green, because many of the cost and the amount of work you need to do to get some of these credentials sometimes is really low, and that's been actually a detriment to more progress on actually reducing carbon emissions and water consumption in this sector. And I think those days are going to be, if they're not over already, they're going to be over soon, because again, climate change and investors looking for low carbon assets don't care if you're paying, doing not much green. They actually want to see, are you less exposed to changes in carbon policy? Are you going to lose clients because your carbon footprint is too big? And that is data driven. So I think we're going to see a lot of change going forward in the future. And those that move today, just like it happened in the office sector, the ones that move first are the ones that reap a lot of their rewards for quite some time.
And Virginie, do you approach as well other operators and see whether they will be interested in getting a bit greener and offering also some financing? Or is it something that goes to you, or will you approach different hotels operators? How does that work?
The reality is that we can't finance every single hotel in Australia, unfortunately. Would be great to get I don't know, greener hotels, but it's impossible, right? We don't have the capital. So for us, it's really to find a few projects that can really inspire the rest of the investor community and to start driving change, because otherwise, I mean, we can't do this on our own. We need to find the projects, and then the partners that will lead the way. In an ideal world, we wouldn't be needed, right? But the reality is a little bit different. So when we look at projects, we like to talk about them a lot, as you can see today. But it's to really share the learnings with the asset owner and asset managers, to really say, well, this is possible. It doesn't take a lot to actually get to good energy performance, at least way above the average. And within that, actually, with a little bit more focus, you can actually be a high performer. So that's usually the way we approach every single sector when we look at investments.
I'd like to open for questions from the audience.
So there have been a lot of studies. One of them is, and some of them have been quite long term. So I might just point you. I don't know all the numbers by heart, but the two organizations that are doing a lot of work at the moment. One of them is MSCI, and MSCI have been doing reports on the major portfolios for quite some time. And possibly, I'll say the earliest one I've seen was from 2012, and they had a couple of years when they stopped doing it, and they came back this year. So they do have very recent stats on that. And the second company, the name just escapes me, but we can probably send them after this session. And just to give you the summary, because there are figures and a lot of them are public, but organizations that have higher neighbors ratings compared to lower neighbors ratings, because you can compare most buildings in offices, they see, in some sectors they see higher rentals, and a lot of them they don't see higher rentals, but they see lower vacancies. And vacancies is the name of the game. It's not unlike hotels, actually, but it's the name of the game in offices. 10% vacancies, very expensive for an office building. A building like this, if we had one floor out of 50 something empty, that would cost lend lease millions and millions of maybe $3 or $4 million a year. So it's a lot more than the power bill. So lower vacancies, you have higher neighbors ratings, you actually have more people, and particularly government, renting the building. So across the portfolio, you have lower vacancies. Lower vacancies means much higher yield. So we do see longer leases on offices that have higher ratings, partly because the clients that they're attracting are governments, very long-term contracts, very secure. Big banks, a lot of them have neighbors policies. They don't go into buildings that have less than 5 stars. Very long-term contracts as well, so longer contracts. So you see sometimes people think that rent is going to be the difference, and sometimes it is, but often it's not. Often there's not a big difference in rent if both buildings are premium, but we do see a difference in vacancies, and vacancy means a lot of money.
I can probably add to this question a bit of an experience that we are making. So as we are now coming close to, I guess, opening, well, 7 out of the 8 hotels from our fund one will be standing income producing in the next 6 months. And so we're having a couple of institutional investors coming to us and saying, well, we can't invest into development, but now it's a pool of standing assets. It's really of interest. So there was, we have a couple of eye-opening meetings where, in particular, I think, I don't know if it's, Australia, in Holland and in Canada, where kind of these pension funds literally tell you, so, are you ESG compliant? What are you doing? Because if you are not minimum average or above, we're using a 20% discount in our model, and that quite often makes it really not very attractive at all. So these are eye-opening moments for us. That's on the, I guess, investor side. And then maybe another point on the, I guess, legislation side. And I know that, people are hearing this. So, well, when will we ever really have, minimum 3 or 4 star neighbors rating for hotels? Well, I think last month or the month before, California, the state of California in the US, which to my mind is not necessarily always the kind of role model when it comes to sustainability, they outlawed bathroom miniatures in hotels. So it's against the law, right? Now, keeping that in mind, so you now have to figure out bulk and everything else. So that's why I say it's not a question if, it's just a question of when. A mandatory neighbors rating for hotels is coming, right? Maybe in 6 months, maybe in 18 months, but it's on its way. And as I said, the investors who are looking a little bit ahead, long term, they are starting to be very, very sensitive on this. The answer is yes. So banks are starting to wake up to the fact that, summarize it, if you have on the one side a company, that has whatever, a lot of policy in place, is trying to achieve the best ESG or following best ESG standards and all the rest of it, versus, a company that doesn't really do anything about it. Well, from a risk perspective, and this is really all what banks are for, right? From a risk perspective, company A that follows all these ESG standards, probably has the right risk management in place, the right policies, etc., is a lower risk for you than the one who doesn't do anything. So yes, the answer is, although we couldn't really quantify it at the time, but certainly banks are waking up to the fact that there's probably a reason why, like insurance companies, giving, people are paying lower premiums for certain risk profile. The similar thing is now happening with banks and them providing debt facilities to various companies. Absolutely.
You look at the example of office. So green bonds are becoming very mainstream now for the top office funds. They look at sustainability-linked debt. It's becoming very normal for them, more like they wouldn't go for a normal bank loan anymore. It's like, I need something else attached to it that looks better and at least reflects the company better than just like plain vanilla. Like they don't want to be part of the, the bulk anymore. And it's a key differentiator as well. So we see that across all sectors, and that will happen to hotels as well.
Yeah, just to complement that as well, we actually have been and are doing work with a lot of the major banks exactly on that space, and a lot of them have set up in the last few years kind of like sustainable finance divisions within the organization. A lot of them have quotas inside that a minimum percentage of the investment that goes into property and infrastructure has some kind of like green credentials, and those quotas are growing. So I think there's a lot of work happening in this space. Just to name an example, a lot of the major banks, the Commonwealth Bank has a corporate target for all their buildings and all their branches. All their buildings are actually certified in the neighbors. They need to be 5 stars. If they're not, they need to have a plan to get them as soon as they can. Internally, they're doing a lot of work on bringing that to the assets. Particularly the buildings they help finance as well. It's the same with ANZ as well. And ANZ has had targets for neighbors rating for quite some time. We're working with them on, what are the targets that they should be setting now? The market in offices in particular has moved a lot in the last few years. Should banks be financing buildings that are only aiming to 4 stars in that market? In offices, by the way, is an older tool. So there's a lot of buildings that are getting to 5 stars today. So we need to up the game in that in that space. So there's a lot of interest in banks, and they're looking at data now. Where is this market at? What is really 5 or 10% best of the market? What's the 15% lowest carbon, which is what you need for a green loan or a climate bond? And so that space is moving a lot. We're actually going into our offices and training their teams. And a lot of them don't even work in the sustainable finance division. They just work in property. So I think again, from the bank side, they are seeing the pressure and they are looking to position themselves as a driver in this space as well. In most of the sectors where people haven't spent years trying to reduce every bit of energy in those buildings, there's a lot of buildings that have 20, 25% energy saving opportunities that are very low cost, often almost zero cost. And that's because there are literally, it's very simple, there's literally things operating where you don't necessarily need them. So things operating in the middle of the night when there's no one around at full capacity, things operating on days when there's not that many people in. So there's a lot of opportunities to reduce energy that are very low cost. The gap between 3 stars and 4.5 stars, just so we get an idea, is somewhere around maybe 35% energy reduction, or 40%. So it's not a small gap, but a significant portion of that could be done by just really good operation with good energy analytics, and it will definitely require some capex. But the capex is really difficult to give you a number, because every hotel is different. It's giant machines. They all have kind of the same components, but in a completely different mix. So what you need to invest in every building is a little bit different. But what I would say is, it's not going to be 40% of heavy capex. Is often the path, and what we see, particularly in shopping centers, in offices, is that most organizations let's go for $0 to very low cost, maximize that. Then what is the lowest capex? What is the next equipment that we're replacing anyway? It's in a year and a half? Great. So we're going to replace that, but instead of just buying exactly the same thing we had before, well, maybe we can invest 5% more and buy something that is going to help us reduce a lot more. So that's really been the path in offices. It hasn't been, let's just spend golden plate office buildings. It's been maximizing operation, maximizing all the $0 opportunities. Night audits, these things are not sexy, but people literally go into office buildings at night and go, why is it 25% of things on? What's on? Can we turn it off? There's a lot of that to be gained in hotels as well. And obviously, CapEx will be a factor to go into 4.5 stars, but it will probably be less than a lot of people think.
We do have some things mentioned here, for example, the EMS, so the energy management system, with a television link. I mean, it sounds very trivial and obvious, but there's one thing, you have one sensor or one system that allows you, whenever somebody leaves the room, to effectively shut off the lights and hopefully as well the air conditioning. And it's something else, or turn down, and it's something else to have that as well linked to the television, right? So I mean, these are easy things, but yes, so certainly we are trying to, leverage of as many of the kind of new tech opportunities that are out there. We have people in-house who have a lot of expertise there, plus, again, with now a partner like CEFC, who most likely invested into some of those latest kind of prop-lab companies as well. There is a couple of good, brainstorming sessions that we are having on these ESG committees. So yeah, so in other words, in short, yeah, absolutely, it's an area we're looking into, and I think everybody should. And as we said before, some of them are things that you really have to build into your design of a building. Other ones you can also do, as an afterthought, and it still is not capex prohibitive. So yes.
In a lot of the technology we see, and that's for real estate, but also energy, is around how you manage your data, and especially when you start having a complex system with solar PV and maybe one day batteries, you need to have the proper system to manage all of that, and that's a lot of like the new companies getting into this sector to be able to help you manage your energy. Where is the load? Where is the energy coming from? And get the most of it. Buy when the energy is at the lowest. That's something that is very live.